Marcus Rivera sat alone at the far end of Murphy's Tavern, nursing his second beer of the evening. The amber liquid caught the dim overhead light as he slowly rotated the bottle between calloused hands. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much, but chose to speak little about it. His dark hair was cropped short in military fashion, though he had been out of the service for nearly 3 years now. The tavern buzzed with its usual Friday night crowd. Construction workers unwinding after a long week, college students celebrating the end of finals, and regulars who treated Murphy's like their second home filled the worn wooden tables and red vinyl booths. The jukebox in the corner played classic rock at a volume that allowed conversation without drowning it out completely. Marcus preferred the corner seat because it gave him a clear view of the entire establishment while keeping his back to the wall. Old habits from his time overseas died hard. He watched the crowd with the same careful attention he once used to scan Afghan villages for threats, though here the biggest danger was usually someone drinking too much and starting an argument about sports. The bartender, Jake Morrison, moved behind the bar with practiced efficiency. At 28, Jake had been working at Murphy's for 4 years, ever since he dropped out of community college. He was tall and lean with blonde hair that he kept styled in a deliberate mess. Tonight, like most nights, Jake wore a black t-shirt that showed off tattoos covering both arms. The ink told stories of rebellion and nights he could barely remember, though he wore them like badges of honor. Jake had noticed Marcus when he first started coming in about 6 months ago. The guy was different from their usual crowd. He never caused trouble, never got too drunk, and always left a decent tip. But there was something about Marcus that rubbed Jake the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, like he was always watching and judging. Or maybe it was the way other customers seemed to respect him without Jake understanding why. The truth was, Jake felt overlooked in his own workplace. He mixed drinks, wiped down tables, and listened to the same complaints and stories night after night. He had dreams once, of traveling, of making something of himself. But those dreams felt more distant with each passing year, and resentment had slowly crept in to fill the space where ambition used to live. Marcus took another sip of his beer and checked his watch. 9:30. He would finish this drink and head home to his small apartment across town. Tomorrow he had an early shift at the construction company where he worked as a foreman. The job paid well enough and kept his mind occupied, though it was a far cry from the sense of purpose he had felt during his military service. 3 tours in Afghanistan had changed Marcus in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had never been there. He had been a staff sergeant, responsible for the lives of the men and women under his command. The weight of that responsibility had never fully lifted from his shoulders, even though his unit had made it home safely. Well, most of them had. The memory of his friend Tommy getting hit by an improvised explosive device still visited Marcus in quiet moments like this. Tommy had been just 23, full of jokes and plans for when they got back to the States. The blast had taken him instantly, and Marcus had held his friend's hand as medics worked frantically to save a life that was already gone. Marcus shook off the memory and focused on the present. The tavern was getting busier as the night progressed. A group of college-aged kids had claimed the pool table and were growing louder with each round of shots they consumed. Near the front windows, 2 middle-aged men argued good-naturedly about whether the local football team had any chance of making the playoffs. At a table in the center of the room, Sarah Chin sat with 3 of her co-workers from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Sarah was 29, with long black hair that she usually kept pulled back during her shifts but wore down when she was off duty. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that made patients feel comfortable even during difficult procedures. Tonight, Sarah was celebrating a small victory. She had successfully advocated for additional pain medication for an elderly patient whose doctor had been reluctant to increase the dosage. It had taken 3 conversations and some research on her part, but she had finally convinced the physician that the patient's quality of life was suffering unnecessarily. Sarah's coworkers were encouraging her to apply for a position in hospital administration, insisting that her combination of clinical knowledge and people skills would make her valuable in a leadership role. Sarah was tempted, but also worried about losing the direct patient contact that made her job meaningful. She glanced around the tavern and Her eyes briefly met those of the quiet man sitting alone in the corner. She had noticed him during previous visits to Murphy's. He always sat in the same spot, always seemed alert and aware of his surroundings, and always treated the staff politely. There was something about his bearing that suggested military service, though she had never spoken to him directly. Marcus noticed Sarah's glance and nodded politely before returning his attention to his beer. He had seen her here before and appreciated that she seemed like one of the good ones, someone who worked hard and treated others with respect. In his experience, you could tell a lot about people by how they acted when they thought nobody was watching. Behind the bar, Jake was growing increasingly frustrated with a difficult customer who kept changing his order and then complaining about the drinks Jake prepared. The man was clearly drunk, but not quite drunk enough to justify cutting him off. Jake mixed the third version of what was supposed to be a simple vodka tonic, while fighting the urge to say something he might regret. The customer, a heavy-set man in an expensive suit, waved dismissively at Jake's efforts. "This still doesn't taste right," he slurred. "Don't they train bartenders anymore? Or do they just hire anyone off the street?" Jake bit back his initial response and forced a smile. "Let me try again, sir. Maybe a different vodka. Maybe a different bartender," the man muttered, though loud enough for Jake to hear. The comment stung more than Jake expected. He had been dealing with difficult customers for years, but tonight something about the insult hit differently. Maybe it was because he had been questioning his own life choices more lately, wondering if this job really was all he was capable of. As Jake reached for a premium vodka from the top shelf, he caught sight of Marcus in the mirror behind the bar. The veteran was watching the interaction with that same calm attention he always seemed to have. For some reason, Marcus's presence made Jake feel even more self-conscious about being dressed down by the drunk customer. Jake finished preparing the drink with extra care, ensuring the proportions were perfect and garnishing it with a fresh lime. When he set it in front of the customer, the man took a sip and made an exaggerated face of disgust. "Still wrong," he announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "What kind of establishment is this?" Several other customers turned to look, and Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. He had prepared the drink exactly as requested, using top-shelf ingredients and proper technique. The problem was not with the drink, but with the customer's attitude and level of intoxication. Marcus continued to observe the situation while staying out of it. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best thing you could do was remain alert but uninvolved unless someone was in real danger. The bartender seemed capable of handling one difficult customer, even if he was clearly frustrated by the situation. Sarah and her co-workers had also noticed the commotion at the bar. One of her friends, Lisa, rolled her eyes and made a comment about people who could not handle their alcohol. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the young bartender, who was obviously trying his best in a difficult situation. The drunk customer finally stumbled away from the bar toward the restroom, leaving Jake to clean up the mess and try to compose himself. Several other customers needed drinks, and Jake threw himself into the work as a way to channel his frustration into something productive. Marcus finished his beer and signaled Jake for his check. When Jake brought the bill over, Marcus left a $20 tip on a $15 tab without saying anything about it. The gesture was not meant to be condescending, but rather a simple acknowledgement that service industry work was harder than many people realized. Jake pocketed the tip with a curt nod, though he wondered if the large gratuity was some kind of pity offering. The veteran probably thought he was just another loser stuck in a dead-end job with no ambition or prospects. The assumption bothered Jake more than it should have, partly because he worried it might be true. As Marcus stood to leave, the drunk customer emerged from the restroom and immediately began complaining to anyone who would listen about the poor service he had received. Most patrons ignored him, but his loud voice was beginning to disrupt the general atmosphere of the tavern. Marcus paused near the door, watching as the situation developed. The customer was demanding to speak to a manager and threatening to leave negative reviews online. Jake was trying to remain professional, but the tension in his posture suggested he was reaching his limit. Sarah caught Marcus's eye again as he stood by the exit. Something in his expression suggested he was debating whether to get involved. She found herself hoping he would stay, though she could not have explained exactly why. The drunk customer returned to the bar and began berating Jake again, this time with more personal insults mixed in with his complaints about the drinks. Jake's hands were clenched into fists at his sides as he tried to maintain his composure and follow company policy about difficult customers. Marcus made his decision. He walked back toward the bar, not to intervene directly, but to position himself where he could act quickly if the situation escalated beyond verbal abuse. His movement was casual enough that most people would not notice, but anyone with military or law enforcement experience would recognize it as a tactical positioning. Jake noticed Marcus's approach and misinterpreted it as another customer coming to witness his humiliation. The combination of embarrassment, frustration, and wounded pride that had been building all evening suddenly crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. The drunk customer chose that moment to lean across the bar and grab Jake's shirt, pulling him forward while launching into another tirade about incompetent service. Jake's training kicked in automatically. He had dealt with grabby customers before, but this time something inside him snapped. Instead of simply removing the customer's hand and stepping back as he had been taught, Jake felt a surge of anger that had been months in the making. The customer's grip on his shirt felt like a symbol of everything wrong with his life, being pushed around, disrespected, and trapped in a situation he could not escape. Marcus saw the change in Jake's body language and took another step closer, recognizing the signs of someone about to make a decision they might regret. But before he could say anything, Jake had jerked free of the customer's grip with more force than necessary. The drunk man stumbled backward, nearly falling, and his face flushed with indignation. "Did you just push me?" he demanded. "I want to see the owner right now." Jake's heart was pounding with adrenaline and anger. "The owner's not here," he said through gritted teeth. "But I am, and I think you've had enough to drink." "You can't cut me off," the customer shouted. "I'm a paying customer, and I demand proper service." The entire tavern had gone quiet now, with everyone watching the confrontation unfold. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as she recognized the signs of a situation about to spiral out of control. Her medical training had taught her to spot the early warning signs of violence, and she could see them clearly in both men's postures and expressions. Marcus remained where he was, close enough to act, but not so close as to escalate the situation by his presence. He had seen similar confrontations in bars near military bases, and he knew they could go from heated argument to serious violence in a matter of seconds. Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he struggled to control his emotions. Part of him knew he should call the owner or simply wait for the customer to leave on his own. But a larger part of him was tired of being pushed around and disrespected, and the alcohol fumes rising from the customer made his complaints seem even more unreasonable. "Sir," Jake said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I need you to settle your tab and leave." The customer's face contorted with rage. "I'm not going anywhere until I get proper service and an apology for the way I've been treated." Marcus could see that neither man was likely to back down at this point. The customer was too drunk and belligerent to accept defeat gracefully, and the bartender was too angry and embarrassed to simply walk away. The situation had reached the point where outside intervention might be necessary to prevent it from escalating further. Sarah was thinking the same thing. She had experience dealing with agitated people in the emergency room, and she recognized the potential for real harm in the current standoff. She caught Marcus's eye and saw that he was also preparing to step in if necessary. The drunk customer leaned forward again, pointing an unsteady finger at Jake's face. "You're nothing but a punk kid who doesn't know how to do his job," he snarled. "No wonder you're stuck pouring drinks for people better than you." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about how others saw him. The customer had identified and attacked exactly the insecurity that Jake tried hardest to hide, that he was a failure who would never amount to anything significant. Marcus saw the moment when Jake's self-control finally snapped. The young man's face went from red with anger to white with rage, and his posture shifted from defensive to aggressive. Marcus had seen the same transformation in young soldiers who had been pushed past their breaking point, and he knew what came next. Jake's hand moved toward the soda gun beside the register, his fingers wrapping around the metal dispenser as his rational mind was overwhelmed by months of accumulated frustration and humiliation. The customer continued his verbal assault, unaware that he had crossed a line from which there might be no easy return. The tavern held its breath as Jake raised the soda gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. In that moment, the accumulated weight of every slight, every dismissal, and every moment of feeling powerless coalesced into a single point of decision that would change everything for everyone in the room. Jake's fingers squeezed the trigger of the soda gun before his rational mind could stop him. A stream of cola erupted from the dispenser, arcing through the air and splashing directly across the drunk customer's expensive suit and face. The dark liquid dripped from the man's nose and chin as silence fell over Murphy's tavern like a heavy blanket. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The customer stood frozen in shock, cola dripping onto his Italian leather shoes while his mouth hung open in disbelief. Jake still held the soda gun, his chest heaving as the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. Around the tavern, conversations had stopped mid-sentence as patrons turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Marcus felt his muscles tense automatically, recognizing the pause before chaos that he had experienced too many times in hostile territory. The drunk customer's face was cycling through confusion, shock, and rapidly building rage as he processed what had happened. Marcus could see the man's hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as he prepared to retaliate. Sarah gripped her wine glass tighter, her medical training making her acutely aware of how quickly situations like this could turn dangerous. She had treated too many victims of bar fights to believe this would end with just hurt feelings and damaged clothing. The customer's voice, when it finally came, was a low growl of pure fury. "You little piece of garbage," he snarled, wiping cola from his eyes. "Do you have any idea how much this suit cost? Do you know who I am?" Jake set down the soda gun with trembling hands, part of him horrified by what he had done, and part of him feeling a savage satisfaction at finally striking back at someone who had been tormenting him. "I know exactly what you are," Jake replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "You're a drunk bully who thinks money gives you the right to treat people like trash." The customer's face turned purple with rage. Without warning, he lunged forward, reaching across the bar to grab Jake by the throat. His fingers closed around the young bartender's neck as he tried to drag him across the wooden surface. "I'm going to destroy you," he screamed. Marcus moved instantly, his body reacting with the trained efficiency of someone who had been in combat. He covered the distance to the bar in 3 quick strides, his hand clamping down on the customer's wrist with enough pressure to make the man release Jake immediately. "That's enough," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The customer spun around to face this new threat, and Marcus could smell the alcohol on his breath mixed with expensive cologne and rising sweat. "Get your hands off me," the customer demanded, trying to pull his wrist free from Marcus's grip. "This is none of your business." Marcus maintained his hold without increasing the pressure, his eyes locked on the customer's face. "You made it everyone's business when you put your hands on him," he replied calmly. "Now I think it's time for you to leave." The customer's eyes narrowed as he took in Marcus's appearance, the military bearing, the calm confidence, the way other patrons were giving them space without being asked. "I see," he sneered. "Another loser standing up for losers. What are you, some kind of reject soldier?" Marcus felt a familiar cold anger settle in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced when facing enemies who showed no respect for human dignity. But his training had taught him to channel that anger into controlled action rather than explosive violence. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," Marcus replied, releasing the customer's wrist but remaining ready to act if necessary. "And, right now, you're being a bully." Jake watched the confrontation with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. He had not asked for help, and part of him resented that this stranger felt the need to intervene on his behalf. But another part was relieved that someone had stepped in before the situation could get worse. The customer rubbed his wrist where Marcus had gripped it, his alcohol-clouded mind struggling to process this new dynamic. He had been prepared to dominate one young bartender, but facing down a clearly experienced veteran was a different proposition entirely. "You don't know who you're messing with," the customer said, though with less conviction than before. "I could buy and sell both of you losers." Sarah had risen from her table during the confrontation, positioning herself where she could reach the emergency exit quickly if necessary. Her co-workers were urging her to sit back down, but Her nursing instincts were telling her that someone might need medical attention before this was over. Marcus studied the customer's posture and concluded that the immediate physical threat had passed. The man was still angry and drunk, but he was also beginning to realize that he might be outmatched. However, Marcus's experience had taught him that cornered animals were often the most dangerous. Money doesn't give you the right to put your hands on people, Marcus said evenly. And it definitely doesn't make you better than anyone else here. The customer's face flushed red again. Better than you? I make more in a month than you probably see in a year, and I didn't get it by serving drinks to degenerates in some dive bar. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but kept his voice level. What you make doesn't matter. What matters is how you treat people. Jake had been listening to the exchange with growing irritation. Here he was, watching two men argue about his worth like he was not even present. The veteran might be defending him, but the conversation still made him feel small and powerless. I can fight my own battles, Jake said suddenly, stepping around the bar to face both men directly. The movement surprised everyone, including Marcus, who had assumed the bartender would be grateful for the intervention. The customer laughed harshly. Fight? You? The only thing you can do is squirt soda like a 12-year-old having a tantrum. Jake's face reddened with renewed anger. At least I work for a living instead of getting drunk and picking on people who can't fight back. Can't fight back? The customer repeated mockingly. So you admit you're weak. That explains the soda gun, coward's weapon for a coward's fight. Marcus could see that Jake was about to do something stupid. The young man's body language screamed aggression, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Marcus had seen the same signs in young soldiers who were about to charge headfirst into situations they could not handle. Nobody needs to fight anybody, Marcus said, positioning himself between Jake and the customer. This has gone far enough. But Jake was beyond listening to reason. The customer's words had struck at the core of his insecurities, confirming every doubt he had about his own worth and courage. 3 years of frustration and self-loathing crystallized into a need to prove himself, regardless of the consequences. Get out of my way, Jake told Marcus, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. This is between me and him. Marcus did not move. No, it's not. It's over. The customer sensed an opportunity in the tension between his two opponents. That's right, soldier boy. Stay out of it. Let the little bartender prove he's a man. Marcus turned slightly to face the customer, his expression hardening. You need to shut up and leave. Now. The customer smiled nastily. Or what? You'll assault me? In front of all these witnesses? I don't think so, hero. You're all talk. Sarah could not stand watching the situation deteriorate any further. She approached the group with the confident stride she used when dealing with difficult patients in the emergency room. Excuse me, she said firmly, looking directly at the customer. I'm a nurse, and I can tell you're exhibiting signs of alcohol poisoning. Slurred speech, aggressive behavior, poor judgment. You need medical attention. The customer turned his bleary gaze towards Sarah, looking her up and down with obvious interest. Well, hello there, beautiful. Want to examine me more closely? Sarah's expression did not change. I'm serious. You're clearly intoxicated beyond safe limits. You should go home and sleep it off before you do something you'll regret. The customer laughed loudly. The only thing I regret is wasting my time in this dump with these losers. But talking to you might make up for it. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge at the customer's obvious leering towards Sarah. The man had crossed from simple drunken belligerence into harassment, and that was a line Marcus would not tolerate. That's it, Marcus said quietly. You're leaving now, whether you want to or not. The customer's attention snapped back to Marcus, and his face twisted with renewed anger. Try it, soldier boy. Touch me again, and I'll have you arrested for assault. Jake had been watching the exchange with growing frustration. Here was the nurse trying to help, the veteran trying to protect everyone, and the customer continuing to be an aggressive drunk. Meanwhile, Jake felt like a spectator in his own workplace, unable to handle his own problems. This is my bar, Jake said loudly, causing everyone to turn toward him. My responsibility. I'll handle it. Before anyone could react, Jake stepped around Marcus and shoved the customer hard in the chest. The drunk man stumbled backward, his expensive shoes slipping on the wet floor where cola had dripped earlier. The customer's arms windmilled as he tried to regain his balance, But momentum carried him backward into a table where two construction workers had been quietly nursing their beers. The table tilted under his weight, sending glasses crashing to the floor and beer splashing across the startled workers. "Hey!" one of the construction workers shouted, jumping to his feet as beer soaked into his work clothes. "What the hell?" The customer struggled to get up from the broken glass and spilled beer, his expensive suit now ruined beyond repair. "I'm suing everyone in this place," he screamed. "Assault. Property damage. I want everyone arrested." The construction worker who had been splashed with beer was a large man named Tony Castellano. He had been having a difficult day himself. His crew had fallen behind schedule on their current project, and his boss had been riding him hard about meeting deadlines. The last thing he needed was some drunk stranger crashing into his table and ruining his clothes. "You want to be sued?" Tony demanded, advancing on the customer. "How about I give you something worth suing about?" Marcus quickly moved to intercept Tony, recognizing that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. "Easy, friend. He's drunk and not worth the trouble." Tony looked at Marcus, taking in his military bearing and calm demeanor. "You with this idiot?" he asked, nodding toward the customer. "No," Marcus replied. "Just trying to keep things from getting worse." The customer had managed to get back on his feet, though he was unsteady and bleeding from a small cut where broken glass had scratched his hand. "Worse," he laughed hysterically. "You people have no idea what worse looks like. I'm going to destroy all of you." Jake felt a sick feeling in his stomach as he realized what he had started. The customer was bleeding, property was damaged, and other patrons were getting involved. What had begun as a simple confrontation over drinks was becoming something that could ruin lives and careers. Sarah had grabbed napkins from a nearby table and was moving toward the customer to tend to his cut hand, her medical training overriding any personal feelings about his behavior. But the customer saw her approach and misinterpreted her intentions. "Stay away from me," he shouted, stumbling backward and nearly falling again. "You're all in on this together." Sarah stopped in her tracks, holding up her hands to show she meant no harm. "Sir, you're bleeding. Let me help you." The customer looked down at his hand as if noticing the blood for the first time. The sight seemed to sober him slightly, and for a moment he appeared confused about where he was and how he had gotten there. Marcus seized the opportunity. "Let the nurse look at your hand," he said calmly. "Then we can call you a cab and get you home safely." The customer's moment of clarity passed, and his face hardened with renewed anger. "Home? I'm not going anywhere until someone pays for what happened here." Tony, the construction worker, was growing impatient with the extended drama. "Look, pal," he said to the customer. "You crashed into my table, ruined my clothes, and wasted my beer. Far as I can see, you owe me." The customer turned to face Tony, his alcohol-impaired judgment making him believe he could handle the much larger man. "I don't owe you anything. This was all their fault." He pointed wildly at Jake and Marcus. Jake felt his anger return as he watched the customer continue to deflect responsibility for his own actions. "You grabbed me first," Jake said hotly. "Everything that happened after that was because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself." The customer's eyes narrowed as he focused on Jake. "You assaulted me with that soda gun, you little punk. That's battery, and I'm pressing charges." Marcus stepped forward slightly, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. The customer was clearly not thinking rationally, and his threats about legal action suggested he might do something even more destructive. "Nobody assaulted anybody," Marcus said firmly. "You grabbed him first, and he defended himself. Everything after that was an accident." The customer laughed bitterly. "Accident? Pushing me into that table was an accident? You people must think I'm stupid." Tony cracked his knuckles loudly, the sound cutting through the tension like a gunshot. "Maybe not stupid," he said, "but definitely drunk enough to need a lesson in manners." Sarah could see that the situation was about to explode into serious violence. Multiple men were posturing aggressively. Alcohol and adrenaline were fueling poor decisions, and the customer seemed determined to escalate rather than de-escalate. "Everyone needs to calm down," she said loudly enough to be heard throughout the immediate area. "This is getting out of hand." The customer turned his attention back to Sarah, and his expression shifted from anger to something more predatory. "You know what would calm me down, sweetheart?" he said with a leering grin that made several people in the tavern visibly uncomfortable. Marcus felt his self-control slip for the first time since the confrontation began. The customer's behavior towards Sarah crossed every line of decency, and Marcus's protective instincts overrode his usual caution about using violence. "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made everyone in the immediate vicinity take notice. "You apologize to her right now, or this conversation ends very differently." The customer seemed to finally realize that he had pushed things too far. He looked around the tavern and saw faces filled with anger and disgust rather than the support he might have expected for a paying customer. But instead of backing down, his wounded pride and alcohol-soaked judgment made him double down on his aggressive behavior. "I don't apologize to anyone," he declared loudly, "especially not in some dive bar full of lowlifes and rejects." Jake had heard enough. Without thinking, he grabbed a full beer bottle from the bar behind him and took a step toward the customer. "That's it," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You want to see what lowlifes do? I'll show you." Marcus immediately moved to intercept Jake, recognizing the deadly serious intent in the young man's movements. "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't throw your life away on this piece of garbage." But Jake was beyond rational thought. 3 years of accumulated frustration, humiliation, and self-doubt had crystallized into a burning need to prove himself through violence. The customer's insults had stripped away his last vestige of self-control, and the weight of the beer bottle in his hand felt like the first real power he had experienced in years. Sarah watched in horror as Jake raised the bottle, knowing that what happened in the next few seconds would change lives forever. The customer seemed to finally understand the seriousness of his situation, but his intoxication made it impossible for him to react quickly enough to protect himself. Marcus lunged forward to grab Jake's arm, but the younger man was surprisingly quick and determined. The bottle began its downward arc toward the customer's head as chaos erupted throughout Murphy's tavern, and the night took a turn from which none of them would easily recover. Marcus's hand shot out like a striking snake, catching Jake's wrist just as the beer bottle reached the apex of its swing. For a moment, the two men struggled for control of the weapon, their faces inches apart as they wrestled for dominance. Marcus could see the wild desperation in Jake's eyes and recognized it as the same look he had witnessed in combat zones when young soldiers reached their breaking point. "Let go," Jake snarled through gritted teeth, trying to twist his arm free from Marcus's iron grip. "He deserves it." "Not like this," Marcus replied firmly, applying pressure to specific nerve points in Jake's wrist that he had learned during military training. "Not with a weapon." The customer, sobering rapidly at the sight of a beer bottle being wielded inches from his skull, stumbled backward and crashed into another table. This time he collided with a group of college students who had been watching the confrontation with fascination rather than alarm. Their pitcher of beer flew through the air, dousing several nearby patrons and turning the floor into a slippery hazard. One of the college students, a football player named Brad who stood 6'3" and weighed 240 pounds, felt the cold beer soak through his shirt and immediately assumed he was under attack. Brad had been drinking steadily for 2 hours and was in no mood to be collateral damage in someone else's fight. "What the hell, man?" Brad shouted, grabbing the customer by his ruined suit jacket and hauling him upright. "You just dumped beer all over me." The customer tried to explain that he had been pushed, but his words came out as an incoherent slur that sounded more like excuses than explanation. Brad's alcohol-impaired judgment interpreted this as defiance, and he responded by shoving the customer hard enough to send him stumbling across the room. Marcus was still struggling with Jake for control of the beer bottle when he saw the customer careening toward them. The drunk man's trajectory would bring him directly into their wrestling match, potentially causing all three of them to go down in a tangle of flying fists and broken glass. "Look out," Sarah shouted from her position near the wall, but her warning came too late to prevent the inevitable collision. The customer slammed into Marcus, and Jake, just as Marcus finally managed to wrench the bottle from the bartender's grip. The impact sent all three men crashing into the bar, with Marcus taking the brunt of the collision as he tried to protect both the customer and Jake from serious injury. The beer bottle flew from Marcus's hand and shattered against the mirror behind the bar, sending shards of glass raining down on the area where they had fallen. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as a piece of glass found its mark, but his immediate concern was ensuring that Jake and the customer were not seriously hurt. Jake rolled away from the pile and came up swinging blindly, his rational mind completely overwhelmed by adrenaline and rage. His first punch caught the customer in the ribs, doubling the man over and sending him gasping to his knees. Before Jake could throw another punch, Marcus grabbed him from behind in a restraint hold he had learned during military police training. "Stop," Marcus commanded, applying just enough pressure to get Jake's attention without causing injury. "It's over." But the violence was spreading like wildfire throughout the tavern. Tony, the construction worker, had decided that the college student Brad needed to be taught a lesson about pushing people around. The two large men were now squared off near the pool table, circling each other like prize fighters while onlookers cheered and placed impromptu bets. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her medical training making her acutely aware of how quickly the situation was deteriorating. She could see at least 3 people who would likely need medical attention, and the night was far from over. Her hand moved toward her purse where she kept her cell phone, ready to call emergency services if the violence escalated further. Brad threw the first punch at Tony, a wild haymaker that the more experienced construction worker ducked easily. Tony responded with a quick jab to Brad's midsection that knocked the wind out of the younger man and sent him stumbling backward into the pool table. The collision with the pool table sent balls scattering across the floor, creating new hazards for anyone trying to move through the increasingly chaotic tavern. One of Brad's friends, a skinny kid named Jeff who had never been in a real fight in his life, decided he needed to help his buddy and grabbed a pool cue to use as a weapon. Marcus saw Jeff raise the pool cue and immediately realized that the situation had crossed from a simple bar fight into something potentially deadly. Wooden pool cues could cause serious head injuries or broken bones, and the kid holding it looked scared enough to use it without thinking about the consequences. Still maintaining his hold on Jake, Marcus shouted a warning to Tony. "Behind you." Pool cue. Tony spun around just in time to see Jeff swinging the wooden stick toward his head. The construction worker ducked and rolled, his work-hardened reflexes saving him from what could have been a devastating blow. The pool cue whistled through the air where his head had been and splintered against a support post. The sound of breaking would seem to galvanize the entire tavern into action. Patrons who had been content to watch the fight suddenly found themselves either fleeing toward the exits or choosing sides in the growing melee. The neat division between observers and participants disappeared as people were forced to defend themselves or help others. Sarah saw an elderly man near the door lose his balance as fleeing patrons rushed past him. Without thinking, she left her relatively safe position against the wall and moved to help him, guiding him toward the exit while scanning for other people who might need assistance. Meanwhile, the original customer who had started everything was still on his hands and knees, struggling to breathe after Jake's punch to his ribs. Blood from his cut hand was mixing with spilled beer on the floor, creating a slippery mess that made it difficult for anyone to maintain their footing. Marcus made a quick decision. He released Jake and grabbed the customer under his arms, hauling him upright and half-carrying him toward the relative safety of the bar area. The customer was barely conscious, his combination of alcohol consumption and physical trauma making it difficult for him to understand what was happening around him. "I need to get him out of here," Marcus told Jake, who was still breathing hard from their struggle. "Can you handle yourself?" Jake nodded, though his eyes were still wild with adrenaline. "Yeah, I'm good." Marcus was not convinced, but he had more immediate concerns. The customer needed medical attention, and the continuing violence in the tavern made it dangerous for an injured and intoxicated man to remain in the area. Tony and Brad were still fighting near the pool table, their conflict having devolved into a wrestling match as both men tried to gain advantage through size and leverage. Brad was younger and stronger, but Tony had more experience with physical confrontations and was using that knowledge to avoid his opponent's most dangerous attacks. Jeff, the college student who had tried to use the pool cue, was now being confronted by Tony's friend Miguel, another construction worker who had been quietly drinking at the bar until his buddy needed help. Miguel was smaller than the other fighters but had a reputation for being scrappy and unpredictable in a confrontation. You want to use weapons? Miguel demanded, advancing on Jeff with his fists raised. Let's see how tough you are without that stick. Jeff backed away, his confidence evaporating now that his weapon was broken and he was facing an experienced fighter. I don't want any trouble, man. I was just trying to help my friend. Should have thought about that before you tried to cave in Tony's skull, Miguel replied, continuing his advance. Sarah had successfully helped the elderly patron reach the exit and was now moving through the tavern, checking on other people who might be injured or in danger. Her nursing training made her naturally focus on the most vulnerable individuals, but she was also keeping an eye on the overall situation to determine when she might need to call for emergency assistance. She noticed that Marcus was trying to help the original customer, who appeared to be in worse condition than anyone else involved in the fight. The man was pale and sweating, showing signs of shock that could indicate internal injuries or simply severe alcohol poisoning combined with physical trauma. I can help him, Sarah called to Marcus over the noise of the ongoing confrontations. I'm a nurse. Marcus nodded gratefully and carefully transferred the customer to Sarah's care. The man was semi-conscious and mumbling incoherently about lawsuits and arrests, but he was not actively fighting anymore. With the customer temporarily stabilized, Marcus turned his attention back to the expanding violence. Jake had moved behind the bar and was watching the fights with a mixture of fascination and horror, clearly understanding that his actions had triggered something much larger than he had intended. This is all my fault, Jake said when Marcus approached. I should have just taken his crap and let it go. Marcus studied the young man's face and saw genuine remorse rather than continued anger. Maybe, he replied honestly. But he was asking for trouble from the moment he walked in here. The fight between Tony and Brad was reaching a conclusion near the pool table. Both men were showing signs of fatigue, and their movements had become slower and less coordinated. Brad had a bloody nose and was breathing hard, while Tony was favoring his left arm where he had taken a solid punch. Miguel and Jeff were still facing off, but neither seemed eager to actually start fighting. Jeff was clearly out of his depth, and Miguel appeared to be more interested in intimidating the college student than actually hurting him. The problem was that other patrons were beginning to choose sides based on factors that had nothing to do with the original confrontation. Some people were supporting the college students simply because they were younger, while others backed the construction workers because they were regulars at the tavern. Marcus recognized the signs of a situation that was about to spiral completely out of control. What had started as a dispute between two individuals was becoming a larger conflict that could involve dozens of people and result in serious injuries or worse. He made his way toward the center of the action, positioning himself where he could intervene in multiple conflicts if necessary. His military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and prioritize responses, and right now the biggest threat was the potential for the violence to spread beyond the current participants. Everyone needs to stop and think about what they're doing, Marcus called out loudly enough to be heard throughout the tavern. This is way past settling anything. Some of the onlookers turned to look at him, but the active combatants were too focused on their immediate conflicts to pay attention to outside voices. Brad landed a solid punch on Tony's jaw that sent the older man staggering backward, while Miguel had backed Jeff up against the wall near the restrooms. Sarah was still tending to the original customer, who was showing signs of improvement as his shock began to wear off. The man's eyes were clearer now, and he seemed to be understanding his surroundings better, though he was still obviously intoxicated. What happened? The customer asked groggily. Why does everything hurt? Sarah chose her words carefully, not wanting to reignite his anger while he was still vulnerable. You fell and hit some glass. You have a cut on your hand that needs attention. The customer looked down at his bloody hand as if seeing it for the first time. I need to go to a hospital, he said with sudden clarity. And I need to call the police. Marcus heard the customer's words and realized that the situation was about to become much more complicated. Once law enforcement arrived, everyone involved would face potential charges ranging from public intoxication to assault. The legal consequences could be devastating for people like Jake, who could lose his job, or the construction workers, who might face problems with their employers. He looked around the tavern and saw a dozen people who were about to make decisions that would affect their lives for years to come. The original confrontation had been forgotten in the heat of ongoing battles, but the legal system would not care about the individual motivations that had led to this moment. Tony landed a devastating uppercut that lifted Brad completely off his feet and sent him crashing into a table. The college student hit the wooden surface hard and slid to the floor, where he lay motionless for several seconds before groaning and trying to sit up. Miguel had finally lost patience with Jeff's backing away and threw a quick punch that caught the young man in the stomach. Jeff doubled over and fell to his knees, gasping for breath and clearly out of the fight. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the noise of the ongoing confrontations like a knife. Someone had called the police, and Murphy's Tavern was about to become a crime scene. Marcus knew that once the authorities arrived, there would be no more opportunities to de-escalate or minimize the consequences of what had happened. He looked at Jake, who had gone pale at the sound of approaching sirens. The young bartender was clearly realizing that his moment of anger was going to have lasting repercussions that extended far beyond losing his temper with one difficult customer. Sarah was also thinking about the approaching police. As a healthcare professional, she had certain legal obligations to report what she had witnessed, but she also understood that many of the people involved were basically good individuals who had made poor decisions in the heat of the moment. The customer she was treating seemed to be recovering from his shock, but his demands for legal action suggested that he was not inclined toward forgiveness or understanding. His expensive suit was ruined, his pride was wounded, and his alcohol-impaired judgment was still pushing him toward revenge rather than resolution. Marcus made a final decision about how to handle the remaining seconds before the police arrived. The situation was beyond saving, but there might still be opportunities to minimize the damage for some of the people involved. However, whatever happened next would depend on choices made in the next few moments by people whose judgment was compromised by alcohol, adrenaline, and wounded pride. The wailing sirens grew louder as police cruisers pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Tavern, their red and blue lights painting the interior of the bar in alternating colors through the windows. The sound had an immediate sobering effect on everyone inside, causing the remaining fights to wind down as participants suddenly realized the legal consequences they were about to face. Marcus quickly surveyed the scene, taking inventory of injuries and potential evidence that would soon be examined by law enforcement. Tony was nursing a swollen knuckle while Brad remained seated on the floor, holding his nose and checking for loose teeth. Miguel stood over Jeff, who was still struggling to catch his breath after the punch to his stomach. Broken glass, spilled beer, and overturned furniture told the story of violence that had escalated far beyond its humble beginnings. Jake emerged from behind the bar, his face pale and his hands shaking as he contemplated the destruction of his workplace and, likely, his career. The young man who had started the chain of events by spraying cola at a difficult customer now faced potential charges for assault, property damage, and serving alcohol to someone who was clearly intoxicated beyond safe limits. Sarah continued to tend to the original customer, though her patient was becoming more alert and, consequently, more demanding with each passing minute. The man had progressed from semi-consciousness to angry threats about lawsuits and criminal charges. His expensive suit was ruined, his pride was wounded, and his alcohol-soaked brain was fixated on revenge rather than responsibility for his own actions. The first police officers through the door were veterans Mike Patterson and Lisa Rodriguez, both experienced cops who had dealt with hundreds of similar disturbances over their combined 20 years of service. They entered with hands resting casually on their service weapons, eyes scanning the room for immediate threats while mentally cataloging the participants and evidence. "Everybody stay where you are," Officer Patterson announced in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Nobody leaves until we sort this out." Marcus raised his hand slightly to show he was unarmed and cooperative, drawing on his military experience with law enforcement protocols. He knew that the next few minutes would be crucial in determining how seriously the authorities would treat the incident and what charges might be filed. Officer Rodriguez moved towards Sarah and the injured customer, recognizing the medical situation as the most immediate priority. "Ma'am, are you a medical professional?" she asked. "I'm a registered nurse," Sarah replied. "This man has a laceration on his hand and possible signs of shock, but I think he's stable. He's been drinking heavily and was involved in a physical altercation. The customer struggled to sit up straighter when he saw the police officers. "Officers, I want to press charges against everyone here. I was assaulted, battered, and had my property destroyed by these criminals." Officer Rodriguez studied the customer's appearance, noting the obvious signs of intoxication alongside his injuries. His slurred speech, bloodshot eyes, and unsteady movements suggested a blood alcohol level well above the legal limit for driving. "Sir, we'll need to get your statement, but first we need to make sure you receive proper medical attention," Rodriguez said diplomatically. "An ambulance is on the way." Officer Patterson was conducting his own assessment of the scene, interviewing witnesses, and trying to piece together the sequence of events that had led to the current situation. The stories he was hearing varied significantly depending on who was telling them, but certain facts were becoming clear. Jake had indeed sprayed the customer with cola from a bar gun, which constituted assault under state law regardless of the provocation involved. The customer had then physically grabbed Jake, which was also assault. Marcus had intervened to prevent further violence, but his actions could be interpreted as assault as well depending on witness testimony and the customer's willingness to press charges. The subsequent fights involving Tony, Brad, Miguel, and Jeff were separate incidents that had been triggered by the original confrontation but involved different legal considerations. Each participant could potentially face charges based on their individual actions and the testimony of witnesses. Marcus approached Officer Patterson with his military ID in hand, hoping that his veteran status might provide some context for his actions. "Officer, I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera, retired Army. I was trying to prevent the situation from escalating when things got out of hand." Patterson examined the ID and noted Marcus's combat ribbons and service record. "What's your take on what happened here, Sergeant?" Marcus chose his words carefully, knowing that anything he said could be used in court proceedings. The customer had been drinking heavily and became aggressive with the bartender. "When he put his hands on the kid, I intervened to prevent serious violence. Everything after that happened very quickly." Officer Patterson nodded, appreciating Marcus's clear and concise explanation. Military veterans often made reliable witnesses because of their training in observation and reporting, though their tendency to intervene in violent situations sometimes complicated legal matters. Meanwhile, the ambulance had arrived, and paramedics were examining the customer more thoroughly than Sarah's field assessment had allowed. They confirmed her diagnosis of a minor laceration and possible shock, but they also identified signs of alcohol poisoning that required immediate medical attention. "We need to transport him to the hospital," the lead paramedic informed Officer Rodriguez. "His blood alcohol level is dangerously high, and he needs for fluids and monitoring." The customer protested loudly as the paramedics prepared to move him to a stretcher. "I don't need a hospital. I need these criminals arrested. They attacked me without provocation." But his protests were becoming weaker as the combination of alcohol, adrenaline crash, and medical shock took their toll on his system. The paramedics efficiently loaded him onto the stretcher while Officer Rodriguez accompanied them to continue gathering his statement at the hospital. Officer Patterson was left to sort out the remaining participants and witnesses, a task that was complicated by the number of people involved and the conflicting accounts of who had done what to whom. The legal system would ultimately determine individual guilt or innocence, but Patterson's report would heavily influence the charges that were filed. Jake stood near the bar, watching his career crumble as police photographed the damage and collected evidence. The bar's insurance would likely cover the property damage, but his actions had created liability issues that would probably result in his termination regardless of any criminal charges. "I just lost my temper," Jake told Officer Patterson when his turn came for questioning. "The guy was being awful to everyone, grabbing people, making threats. When he put his hands on me, I just snapped." Patterson had heard similar explanations countless times throughout his career. Young people with limited life experience often made poor decisions when confronted with difficult situations, and the legal system was not always merciful toward momentary lapses in judgment. Tony and Brad were being treated for their injuries while providing their own statements about how they had become involved in the violence. Both men were facing potential assault charges, though their attorneys would likely argue that they were defending themselves or others from perceived threats. Miguel and Jeff were in similar legal jeopardy, Though the younger college student's lack of fighting experience and obvious reluctance to participate might work in his favor during plea negotiations, Miguel's more aggressive approach and his reputation among the bar's regular patrons could complicate his legal situation. Sarah was being questioned as both a witness and a medical professional who had provided aid to the injured. Her testimony would be particularly valuable because of her training in observation and her relative neutrality in the conflicts that had occurred. In your professional opinion, Officer Patterson asked her, was the customer intoxicated to a degree that would have impaired his judgment? Sarah considered her answer carefully, knowing that her response could affect multiple legal cases. Based on his behavior, speech patterns, and coordination, I would estimate his blood alcohol content was significantly above the legal limit. He showed signs of severe intoxication that would definitely impair judgment and decision-making. The bartender's decision to continue serving alcohol to someone in that condition could result in additional charges and civil liability for both Jake and the tavern's ownership. Establishments that overserve patrons could be held responsible for accidents or violence that resulted from customer intoxication. As the evening progressed, the various participants were either arrested, cited, or released with instructions to appear in court at later dates. The customer was transported to the hospital where blood tests would provide objective evidence of his intoxication level, while the others faced a complex web of potential charges ranging from disorderly conduct to assault and battery. Marcus was ultimately released without charges, thanks largely to witness testimony that supported his claim of trying to prevent rather than escalate violence. His military background and the respect he commanded from other patrons helped establish his credibility with the investigating officers. Jake was not so fortunate. He was arrested on charges of assault and serving alcohol to an intoxicated person, though he was released on his own recognizance with a court date scheduled for the following month. The young man who had worked at Murphy's Tavern for 4 years walked out of the building in handcuffs, his keys and name tag left behind on the bar. Tony and Miguel were cited for disorderly conduct and released, their experience with the legal system having taught them when to cooperate and when to remain silent. Brad and Jeff faced similar charges, though their lack of criminal records might help them negotiate favorable plea agreements. Sarah gave her contact information to the police and paramedics, knowing that she might be called to testify about the medical aspects of the incident. Her professional reputation and credibility would make her a valuable witness for any party seeking to establish the facts of what had occurred. The customer, meanwhile, was being treated for alcohol poisoning at the city hospital while police officers waited to take his formal statement. His threats about lawsuits and criminal prosecution would be taken seriously by the legal system, but his own intoxication and aggressive behavior would complicate any case he tried to build. In the weeks that followed, the legal consequences of that Friday night at Murphy's Tavern would ripple through multiple lives and families. Jake lost his job and faced potential jail time, though he eventually negotiated a plea deal that included anger management classes and community service. The experience forced him to confront his own issues with self-worth and find more constructive ways to deal with frustration. Tony and Miguel paid fines and completed community service, their construction company standing by them because of their otherwise clean records and reliable work history. Brad and Jeff faced similar consequences, though the incident prompted both young men to examine their relationship with alcohol and their decision-making processes. The customer recovered from his alcohol poisoning but faced his own legal challenges, including potential charges for assault and public intoxication. His lawsuit against the tavern and its employees was eventually settled out of court, though the financial compensation was far less than his initial demands. Marcus continued to visit Murphy's Tavern occasionally, though the new bartender and changed atmosphere made it a different place than it had been before that night. He sometimes thought about the chain of events that had started with one man's inability to handle his alcohol and ended with multiple lives being permanently altered. Sarah used her experience that night to become more involved in community violence prevention programs, recognizing that her medical training gave her unique insights into the consequences of physical confrontations. She eventually became an advocate for better training for service industry workers in dealing with intoxicated and aggressive customers. The incident at Murphy's Tavern became a cautionary tale that was retold in police training courses and bartending school as an example of how quickly situations could escalate beyond anyone's control. The combination of alcohol, wounded pride, and poor decision-making had created a perfect storm that destroyed careers, damaged lives, and forever changed everyone who was present that night. For Marcus, the incident reinforced lessons he had learned in military service about the importance of staying calm under pressure and attempting to de-escalate rather than escalate confrontations. But it also reminded him that sometimes, despite everyone's best intentions, situations develop their own momentum and spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. The broken mirror behind Murphy's bar was eventually replaced, and the tavern reopened with new management and stricter policies about serving intoxicated customers. But the memories of that night lingered for everyone who had been present, serving as a permanent reminder of how quickly ordinary people could find their lives changed by a few moments of poor judgment and uncontrolled anger. Jake eventually found work at a different establishment, having learned valuable lessons about professional behavior and personal responsibility. He never again allowed his personal frustrations to compromise his professional obligations, and he developed better strategies for dealing with difficult customers without losing his temper. The customer who had started everything eventually sought treatment for his drinking problem after the legal and financial consequences of his actions forced him to confront the impact of his behavior on others. The incident became a turning point that led him toward a more responsible relationship with alcohol and a better understanding of how his actions affected people around him. Murphy's Tavern remained a gathering place for the local community, but the events of that Friday night had changed it forever. The new management implemented training programs for staff, installed better lighting and security cameras, and established clearer policies for dealing with intoxicated patrons. The goal was to ensure that no one would ever again have to experience the chaos and consequences that had resulted from one customer's inability to control his behavior and one bartender's moment of lost composure. The story of what happened that night became part of the neighborhood's collective memory, a reminder that alcohol, pride, and poor judgment could combine to create situations that none of the participants had intended and that all of them would regret for years to come.